share here. Yes, okay, great. First round of EUDC 2017. My name is Ayala, I'll be your chair. I don't have a pronoun preference. I'll let my colleagues introduce themselves and their preferred pronouns, if there are any. Short, Svetan, your day. Okay. And now I'll ask the teams to give me their speaking order and preferred gender pronouns, if there are any.
Chris speaking first, he or they.
Okay.
Andrea speaking second, then the preference.
Okay. In opening opposition, KFUA speaking first.
Max, male pronouns.
Michael, no preference.
Okay. In closing government, NYUAD speaking first.
Nikolai speaking first, GLA.
Okay. And
David speaking second, purely.
okay. And in closing opposition, Charles D speaking first.
Those are the preference.
Okay. And
Government, no preference.
okay. Excellent. So, if there are no questions, then on the motion that this House believes that the US should ban extremist groups and e.g. KKK and Nazis, I'm going to call on the Prime Minister to begin the case of Senator and Here you
Panel, ladies and gentlemen, these groups are incredibly harmful, and I will firstly define what these groups are, secondly say why we're in principle justified to defend ourselves against them, thirdly do some preemptive rebuttal, and lastly just go into the specific harms that we inflict upon marginalized communities and upon society as a whole if we don't take action now. Firstly, extremist groups. Extremist groups directly clash with our society's fundamental values. They, for example, oppose liberal democracies. They want to inflict communist dictatorship, fascist dictatorship, or religious dictatorship, or something like that upon us. They actively call for violence or revolution, and they are incredibly, ideologically strictly organized. We want to get rid of them. Why? Our principal justification for this is that these groups actively engage in behavior that harms other people. We've recently seen that rally in Charlottesville. What have we seen there? We've seen incredible amounts of hate speech, not only against black people who are seen as inferior, but also against white women supporting black people who have to be subjugated. We've seen death threats against people who oppose this rally. We've seen violence, people beaten up, even people killed. And we always have that idea that the system should be overthrown, that we should install revolution or whatever. We believe that a liberal democracy has the right to defend itself against these attacks. That does not only mean defending the rights of the people, who we as a government of the people, for the people, by the people should defend, but also defending our liberal democracy against these forces.
Fine.
Sure.
Those are representing political power. Therefore, it's not intrinsically in their interest to be so much marginalized to kill other people. There is correlation, but not causation. You are not showing this.
I will move on to showing this, don't worry. some preemptive rebuttal. Firstly, I think they're going to say that, you know, we need discourse with these people and we need to engage them. But we say discourse with these people is impossible because the ideas they stand for are in no way based in rationality. There's no possible rational justification for believing that one race is better than the other or that women are intrinsically weak. They use different sources of information, such as Breitbart or InfoWars. They use different online forums, different Facebook groups. So there's absolutely no point for contact with them where we could engage in discourse with them and persuade them to take on other ideas. Why? Because this is completely against their interests. The people who lead these movements make money, get reputation, and basically see this as what makes their life worth living to lead these movements. So their utmost interest is to keep these movements going, to keep these movements ideologically pure, and they don't want to engage in discourse with us. We also want to add a second layer of analysis here, and that is that there's no possible ideological middle ground. You can't be a bit communist. You can't enslave black people a bit. There is no possible ideological middle ground where we could meet these people. Therefore, discourse is impossible. But banning them is not mutually exclusive with prevention schemes. So we will still go to schools, go to communities, and tell them, okay, we suspect that these ideas are still around. Please don't join up. They are harmful for reasons ABC. They might also say that banning these groups makes it more appealing to join. But we believe confinement of these groups is more important and will also go against people joining these groups. Why? These groups are already very marginal. For example, the KKK in the 1920s had about 4 million members. Now he has like 5,000 in a nation of 320 million. So we believe if we get them out of the public, if we take away their ability to stage rallies such as the Unite the Right rally that dominate national news for days on end, then there is much less prevalence of their ideas in public discourse, which is what we want. And we also have a higher threshold for your ordinary Joe to join them because he sees this is prohibited by the state. I actually take a certain risk upon me. If I want to join them, I might not want to do that. Okay, lastly, I'm gonna move into the specific harms of not banning these groups. Firstly, we'll have a signaling effect. We'll show these people that it's okay to be a racist. It's okay to want to overthrow society. And I with my fragile whiteness can belong in this group because the state sanctions it. The state basically actively tells me, yeah, you can go there, you can meet with your friends and burn a cross in the forest. We don't really care. But this is not only harmful because it gives white people the feeling that they're right in their racism. This is even more harmful to marginalized communities because these communities reinforce, feel that the state doesn't really care about them, that the state doesn't give them the same opportunities as it gives to white people, and that the state just, doesn't really care. And we just reinforce this narrative by allowing such things as we see in Charlottesville to happen, by allowing that there is this degree of violence, this degree of hate speech, this degree of active harm against them. And therefore we believe that it is incredibly harmful to exactly those communities to, as a state, say, we should have the principal duty to defend you, but we don't really care, just, fend for yourselves. This would be incredibly harmful. We believe as discourse with these groups is not possible. The only way to get them out of the public and to confine their hateful ideology and their hateful deeds is to get rid of them once and for all. Proud to propose.
Prime Minister, for the speech, and I'm happy to call upon the leader of opposition.
Dear panel, as long as there is clear distinction between people who kill other people and people who say some bad stuff, we should not ban people who say bad stuff. Even if those people are irredeemable, this is basically because we harm the very people we are willing to save. Before that, 3 points of rebuttal. First of all, this is a lie that there is no middle ground between those radical racists and wonderful liberal people who have no prejudices. Basically, almost every person in the United States is to some degree sexist. Many people in the United States hold some extent of prejudices. Many people have original identity of Confederate people who feel threatened because the North tried to rewrite history and remove their symbols. All those people, if not do not support those organizations right now, and even if they do, they may not actively participate in them, and all of these are degrees of activity which may change if we ban them, and this is open to discussion. Secondly, there is a huge distinction between belonging to an extremist organization and actively harming society. The proposition side claims that if you are a member, you do bad things. But is it contingent? No, for 2 reasons. First of all, even if organization does not exist, a person with such views can commit bad actions. Most of the terrorist attacks of Islamists in the Western world have not been committed by active members of organization, but by people who have been converted via internet and did a terrorist act on themselves. Secondly, we understand that huge numbers of people who marched in this city did not do any violent acts. This is because they made a conscious moral decision about not breaking the most basic foundations of our society. This is why they're nice people. Second table.
Okay, so after the violent riots in Charlottesville, the far-right extremist newspapers and publications celebrated that there was no signal from the government, which you can only suspect means there will be more violence and more attacks against discriminated groups. How can you stand for having no signal from the government?
Well, they celebrate it because they like it. It doesn't mean that they are going to have greater support from general populace after this act. On the contrary, I believe that their population, after like one of the first right-wing terrorism rather than Islamic terrorism, they supported actually may decrease. But now let's actually move to the argument. First of all, about justification, we believe that this idea on the whole is illegitimate. First of all, because as I've explained before, there is a clear line between people who do terrorism and people who don't do terrorism, and they may or may not belong to distinctive extremist organizations. But secondly, we believe that sometimes, because there's been things about hate speech and discrimination, sometimes we do allow people who say bad things because they are important for them. Like religious speeches. Lots of religion, basically most of mainstream institutionalized religions are right now misogynistic and say things that are deeply offensive to many women. But we do not ban those organizations because people have deeply entrenched identities connected to those religious identities while do not necessarily contributing to discrimination. This is the same logic about races. They are actual United States citizens whose interests we should protect as long as they do not directly infringe on the rights of other people. But right now, let's move to practical points. Why it will harm minorities in America more? Because of 2 reasons. First of all, the members and their direct supporters will be more active. Secondly, they will actually have more support. Why they will be more active? This is simplistic. Right now, as the proposition side have claimed, there are lots of people who have deeply entrenched beliefs about that America is under a threat of Islamic or race or black or whatever is assimilation, and when we say them, either you abandon your core beliefs, either you change your behavior, or we will ban you, those people who believe that America is coming apart, even if they are wrong, they will 100% choose to continue their activities, and those people who are right now sit in some backwater town and once a year wave some flag and then go away because nobody listens to them, will now be more active, will now go to underground, will now actually be more prone to violence, because right now they are illegal. There is no more, there is no way for them to participate legally. There is no more barriers they can break. Secondly, well, which basically leads to those organizations being more active, and actually those acts happening more because they have been long preparing to actually wage violent activities. If the proposition side truly claims that those organizations are more prone to violence, then if we attack them, they are definitely going to attack us back. While if we do not attack them, they are less likely going to attack us back, which is basic logic. Secondly, why they are going to have more support? It's because of a number of reasons. First of all, because, as I have explained, there is a lot of spectrum of people who may in some way be supportive to some of their claims because general stereotypes that they support a different racial population. Secondly, in the Western countries, especially in the United States, there is a wide notion that organizations that do not directly commit any kind of violence should be allowed to exist. And when you break such a basic foundation, many people who do not necessarily support those organizations will feel that they are threatened, will feel that they are unjustly under attack, and will be more prone to help them. Thirdly, there is a large group of so-called Confederates who do not necessarily want to destroy all black people, who do not necessarily want to create discriminating policies. Those are people who have those regional identity of southern states. This is primarily the people who march in that city against removal of statue of Confederate general. They right now do not necessarily partake in the extremist activities, but they are connected, and if they feel that the state that they are right now against violently attacks those organizations, they are more prone to support them. So basically, those people feel that the organization that they may have something in common with is under attack, and secondly, that they in some way may help. So they will help. How they will help? They will not report their activities if they're capable. They will refuse to witness if they have seen something. They may cover them if they are pursued. They may actually fund them, and you cannot 100% monitor all money movements, which means that they are going to have vastly more support than they do right now, because the groups that may be supporting them but do not support them right now because they are alienated by them is huge. So on comparative, we have actually more violence and more discriminations in those states where they have populists which may support them, which means that we're begging to oppose.
I thank the leader of opposition and call on the Deputy Prime Minister.
We good? Okay, great. I'll deal in turn with the three claims made by the previous speaker, the idea that things will still happen, they will get more support, and these groups will continue. And also added about why the US and their kind of experience of the country makes it kind of a unique case that we should need to think about. But first of all, and that will be integrated, but first of all, this idea, the comparison was made between a religion and an extremist group. Okay, we think there's a tacit and fundamental difference between a group with a certain amount of outliers that we still think we should fight, and a group that people join because they are necessarily outliers, okay? People aren't sort of born into the KKK, they're not kind of, they actually join it because what it represents in history and because it aligns with their views, okay? And we think these are just extremist people. You don't get people who stumble into it and then go on a different course, okay? So in religions, you have 99.95% of them are kind of, in it for the right reasons or whatever, inverted commas, but we think there's a fundamental difference between these groups and someone who maybe goes off and commits a crime or a violent act later on, and groups such as the KKK that only espouse hate. This is not free speech, this is hate speech. This is kind of tacit violence against other groups, okay? So, these things will still happen, we heard, okay? Because we can't solve every single violent act, we should not act at all against these groups. Why is this wrong? Firstly, because of kind of group dynamics, okay? So what we think this happens, by allowing these groups, by tacitly admitting them, you make kind of violence done in their name far more likely, okay? Because what you say is that this is okay, this is acceptable, it is legal, so this is kind of to be supported. We heard we can't have discourse with these groups. So you really have this message in kind of the interweb. You think of people's sort of bubbles, and they're only receiving the message that this is good, okay? And what you have, when you have these processions that you can't kind of ban, you have these publications that you can't stop, you have these people who are espousing hate and you cannot act against, it signals to the population as a whole that what they are saying is okay, okay? So you can say, oh, it's bad, but people won't hear this message. The kind of people, you'll be in that zone, you won't like listen to the other side. But having it illegal, having it banned and having it not allowed says, okay, I can't do it. We're not saying that it will never happen. People will still join it, these groups will still exist. What it does do by banning it, one, you have law enforcement that's able to act on it. You have, we think, if you think the deep web, think of message boards, we can access those, okay? You can find paedophile rings, you can find deep stuff that's meant to be very secret, and so there is a way of actively working against it, okay? So this message will still be out there, but we can act against it. And so basically having it legal, which makes it, we actually think, make it more appealing for these people to join, because it's mass visibility, because there's no sanctioning, there's nothing against it, it's open, it's in there. And two, it's less taboo in the public. If it's legal, if it's not if you're like, oh, it's fine, it's just a different political opinion, it's just a different view that I don't happen to share, but I'm okay with it, it says people think, okay, I am interested, I am going to go and explore it. Whereas we think there are kind of social norms that says because something is illegal, it means that I will not act against it. So what else does this signal to people, okay? What does this signal to people? It doesn't just signal to people that the group's okay, it signals to the most vulnerable in society that you are not valued by your government, okay? We think of the US, we think of African Americans, we think of transgender people, we think of groups that feel left in the lurch because the president doesn't come out and say what is happening is wrong. Okay? These people are subject to systemic injustice at every single turn in their lives, effectively. And what happens is when they see on the TV a torch procession openly espousing hate, it makes them feel vulnerable, and justly so, because not only does this inspire these people to think, oh, I'm not alone, I have other people who think in my same kind of radical negative ways, it gives me kind of like confidence in, oh, I'm not alone, maybe people do share it, you know? People on message boards, think of Anders Breivik, who was had this kind of community that he could engage with. And we actually think, building on the principal cases earlier, is that society has a fundamental duty to protect their most vulnerable people, okay? And so having one group of fragile white men feeling a bit sad that they've, I don't know, whatever's happened to them, and then actively kind of inciting hatred against other groups, we think is actually very, very harmful. And why is the US such an important case in this plan? Because we think joining the groups such as the KKK, such as neo-Nazi groups, have a specific contextual understanding in the US which cannot be misinterpreted, okay? You grow up, the KKK were the group of slavery. They were the kind of remnants of the Confederate state that openly advocated the enslavement of the black body. And we think, therefore, the idea that we hear earlier about oh, it's open to interpretation, you don't know, we think is fundamentally misplaced. You don't join the KKK because you're like, oh, I'm kind of in favor of a bit of Confederate solidarity. There are fundamental tenets of this that mean that we need to take that into account. And so we think of groups, so we think of Holocaust denial being illegal in Europe, we think of the way that Germany deals with that past, and we think there's a very analogous situation of dealing with the past and making up for past sins. We think on a principled level, the protection of people who you past subjugated, and the fact that you built your entire country on the back of these bodies means you have a principled responsibility to, when other groups try and attack these people in principled ways, we think you need to go against it. Okay, so it was a period of internal colonialism, and we think that if in any other country, if a group went out and openly espoused hatred against a certain group of people, which is what this is, it would be stopped. Closing.
Yeah.
violence, hate speech, stuff like that. We all saw it during Republican primaries, for example, as well. Would you ban them as well?
No, but the fundamental difference is you are like, okay, you are encouraging, you are signaling to other people they are not important. You are signaling that it's okay. Okay, so the difference between you have a Donald Trump who's saying bad things and he should be addressed, but you can, on a political discourse, engage with that. And we think these kind of groups are the ones you cannot engage with. What my partner brought you in his excellent speech was the idea of engaging with these groups in discourse, okay? And saying, like, if you're watching the Republican primary and you hear this thing, we're not kind of tacitly approving it, but we're saying you're more likely to be kind of engaged in certain discourse around it and people challenging that viewpoint. One thing, you have people in the Republican primary, I'm no big fan of that, but you have Marco Rubio tackling that discourse as it is. And we think if you have kind of a political party where you have disparaging voices kind of saying certain things, we think that's a positive thing. But you have these groups that are only espousing hate, only espousing kind of violence. Okay, you can say it's free speech. But the problem is Dylan Root, who shot up the church in South Carolina, wasn't a member of these groups, but he kind of bought into that discourse, okay? And we think that you may say, oh, it's only speech, but speech has consequences. We don't agree. We agree with free speech. We do not agree in consequence-free speech. And we think you should be held accountable for your words, and these groups only espouse hate, only espouse kind of a system that is terribly harmful to minorities in the USA. And for these reasons, we are very, very proud to propose.
I think the deputy leader of government, deputy prime minister, and deputy call upon the deputy leader of opposition.
Thank you, Honorable Speaker. I'd like to try to be realistic, and I'd like to ask two questions of this debate. Is this policy legit? And is this comparatively better for the most vulnerable people in the United States against whom these organizations operate? On the principle, there are two. Firstly, we say that it is illegitimate to ban an organization who practice their right to free speech as long as they are not violent intrinsically, as long as they are not, as their main goal and their main function isn't violence. Therefore, Honorable Speaker, we have distinction between list of terrorist organizations which are persecuted by the United States of America, by FBI and many other things, and we have things included in Southern Poverty Law Center, right? Things which we would not like to cooperate, but for whom we still recognize the right to free speech. What is the distinction? Even though you have beliefs which are scientifically undefinable, such as like white supremacy or belief in God, if you want to practice it peacefully, you have a right to do this, right? And as long as there are structural reasons for those organizations to compete in political discourse, not to be marginalized and not to be associated with violence directly, they should be entitled to do this. They say, well, religion, they say you are not born into religion. Well, we would like to also maybe challenge free will altogether, right? If it's like all random particles or if it's like all predetermined, in either case, you don't choose your identity of being Republican in the southern provinces. But in any event, there is some degree of autonomy and it varies from individual to individual. So we broadly can brush that either identities aren't chosen entirely, right? So especially, so people aren't born in either identities. And the point is, public spaces should be neutral and should be open to contestation, to competition of ideas. Therefore, we should not ban those ideas as long as they are not hatred. Second principle was here is that the United States of America has a responsibility to black people. Therefore, it should protect their sensitivity from even speech. No, this argument is hung on outcomes, that the outcomes, practical outcomes, all the variety of them, will be better for them. We're contesting that, and therefore this principle specifically doesn't stand. Second question, is it better for the United States citizens? We say no. If those people like neo-Nazi or KKK can't protest publicly and can't engage publicly, they're going to go underground, right? The problem with people with hatred views coming together underground is that it's more toxic environment, which is totally free from any media scrutiny, which necessarily is present when you congregate publicly, for instance, in a square, because there is a media, there is a BBC, there is reporters asking people, what do you think? And there is some sort of like self-restriction because they don't want to be marked as terrorist organizations. When those people come underground, for instance, in some village to some prominent like member of this group, it is much easier for some charismatic person of this group to actually ignite violence and to say, this state is going to crack down on us, is cracking down on us. Therefore, we have to retaliate in a more vicious manner, right? To basically assert our goals violently if we cannot assert them in any other way. More importantly, in this case, they will have nothing to do, nothing to lose. In status quo, they want to support candidates. They want to bring candidates from their own states, and they're actually participating in the debates, in the like rallies in the United States on the local elections. Right now, if they're banned, they can no longer support it, right? Therefore, even if they are marked as terrorist organization, there is nothing to lose, right? They're already like important to participate in any other way. Therefore, being fanatic and being radical is no longer taboo in this discourse, in this like organization. What is going to happen realistically? Realistically, well, several reasons why violence is more likely to happen on the other side. Firstly, states where black people are in tiny minority, like from 1 to 5%. There are some states of this, right? In these cases, where police is prejudiced, where people have a constitutional right to bear guns, it's much more likely that those people are going to retaliate in terms of like direct threats to black people, in terms of catcalling, in terms of maybe being like their property vandalized, graffitied, etc. They're more likely to engage in it in those sort of states. In many other states, people who felt sympathy to those groups are going to be on average more aggressive, right? More importantly, it's more likely to attract radicals, such as Breivik as they say, on this side of the house, because now it's more appealing to people with these psycho problems. Second problem, in terms of like how it's going, what is practically going to happen, it is going to glamorize far right for many people. Why? Because in status quo, it's a showcase of ignorance. It's stupid, big, bold people who have no good agenda, and people can point out, look at them. Do you want to participate? Do you want to belong to such a group? And it's not quite an appealing option, right? So now you ban them. But the problem is, for United States people, First Amendment right is a like fetish. They like freedom of speech. They support it. Therefore, those people are more likely to look like victims. What is the problem? As my partner emphasized, there is a spectrum of people from like the most liberal to the most radical, and people in the middle who currently don't feel sympathy to those people, who feel like very bad about them, now are going to think, okay, those guys are banned. It's against the most fundamental freedoms. Maybe I have to take a look at them. The problem is, when you take a look, those people have pseudoscience, they have some pseudo-narratives, they have alt-right activists such as Milo Yiannopoulos, which are really attractive. If you like dive into this rabbit hole of videos on YouTube of those guys, you're quite likely to stick to them. If they're glamorized and on the verge, those people aren't radicals, many people are more likely to sympathize with. What is the alternative to propose? With the decline of Donald Trump, because of his inefficient policies which are unrealizable, the alt-right is going to, with him, die the next election. If he is seen as the person who supports the crackdown on the vulnerable minority, who stands for the fundamental US values, and has a stake, those people are more likely to activize, more actively support them. The narrative that Donald Trump supports the people against whom, like freedom of speech is taken away, is going to be much more active. On the outside of the house, those people are marginalized, and with like this accident they're pointing out, and with the inadequate response by Donald Trump, he's more likely to reduce his credibility more and more, and therefore general public is even less likely to support him in this election with this narrative. For all of these reasons, we beg you to oppose.
thank the Deputy Leader of Opposition to open the second of the debate and to call one member of government.
Ladies and gentlemen, society's norms are directly shaped by what they see, and by what they see is normal, and by what they see that isn't condemned by society. Everyday discrimination of minority groups in the US is the real violence that lasts until today. People who think that it's okay to discriminate in everyday situations. Today, we are going to stop groups from perpetuating a narrative that's discriminatory, that's violent, and that further discriminates those groups. 3 points that I'm going to deal with before. The first one is on the signal. We've heard a lot in opening half about how we should have a signal and how that would stop people from pursuing those acts. What's critically important, what we add here, is that the current situation is that the President of the United States, the uttermost representative of government and society, does not condemn those people. When Donald Trump goes up and says it's violence on all sides, he doesn't recognize the violence that black people and other minorities in the US faces. We think standing as the government actually makes up for that role and helps people. Secondly, on the difference between hate speech, between hate speech and other groups. We heard from opening opposition that it's really very hard to draw a distinction between, well, is it the church or is it the KKK? We just don't know, right? We think it's very clear to distinguish, and that's the following. If I'm a member of the church and I have a belief about what God is, it does not have to do anything with hate speech. I've never seen someone from the church go up and say, well, black people are just inferior. We think, and I have to credit opening government for saying that, no thank you, they went up and said two groups here in terms of definition. The first one is they perpetuate hate speech, what's under the definition. Other groups don't, and we think if you have political parties like the Republican primaries, we heard from closing opposition, they don't perpetuate direct hate speech. That's fine, that's part of the political process, it's democratic. Then secondly, they said it's about violence. It's a direct call to violence. I've never heard a direct call to violence from a lot of religions in the US and also not from other political actors. So then the third one, rebuttal real quick, it's I deal with it in substance, that's easier. So two things I'm going to talk about. The first one, and that's what we add from closing government today, is how exactly are those extremist groups losing support? The clash in opening half is, will they be stronger? Will they be worse? What's better for those people? We will tell you how they lose support for two reasons. The first one is how exactly do those groups gain support? We tell you that it's based on mass participation and small donors. That means that there's, in terms of funding, no large investors behind the KKK or behind the neo-Nazi groups. And even if you don't believe them, just logically you wouldn't do it because there's a political stigma for it. If you have a business, you're unlikely to get funded. If you're in direct connection with extremist groups, there's unlikely to be large dollars. That then leaves small citizens who buy in that narrative of fear, the narrative of white supremacy, who think they can change the political process by following those groups, and that's good for their own incentives. Those are the ones who are helping those groups, who are supporting those groups, because they don't think they can have any other impact. They do it through that, and therefore those groups gain influence. We think making those groups illegal, just like we have, for example, terrorist groups illegal, means there's unlikely to be any funding anymore because it's illegal. Firstly, it's illegal, but also secondly, because there's a moral and social stigma in doing so. We don't think the average American is likely to support banned, radical, extremist, violent groups. Secondly, in terms of direct support, that's not financial. The goal of those groups is visibility, and we'll tell you more about that later. It's visibility that broadens the range of what's acceptable in society and politics. And it happens through everyday acts. It's demonstrations, which are very clear in KKK robes. It's also everyday, just like putting car stickers on your car saying you accept it. It's posting online blogs that perpetuate narratives that have been put forward by those radical groups. Those everyday actions is what's count, and we're going to make it worse because there's again the moral social stigma. It's illegal to support them, and you're unlikely to support groups in society when you see that society is represented by the government doesn't support it. It's critical. So then why is that important? Because, that's the second point here, it reduces social acceptability and everyday discrimination. How do those groups make things acceptable in society? It's three key points. The first one is they are in the news all the time. The second one is people believe they are big, although they're actually not. And thirdly is because they're not condemned. No matter how powerful a group is, or whether they have arms, and that's why we shouldn't go against them, well, I'd be glad to know what you would do with Al-Qaeda if they have weapons. You wouldn't go against them because they might retaliate. if those groups were condemned, there will be no more discrimination. Why is that? For three reasons. The first one is if you have more visibility, there's a narrative in society that it's okay to discriminate and have a stance that's negative toward minority groups. That's firstly in the extremist groups where they think it's okay to participate and to perpetuate those narratives because society doesn't say anything. And secondly, for sympathizers like the attacker in Charlottesville, who stands outside and who think it's okay to participate in something that's socially acceptable, and that's why it's okay to commit violent acts. It's also because we have biased police. He thinks it's unlikely to be politically prosecuted that much. But thirdly, and most importantly, is the minority groups who see now in society that it's okay. They see they are worse human beings. It's okay to discriminate against them. It furthers that inferiority complex, which we think is the real point in this debate. Then secondly, we think I'll take opening.
Well, mostly the reports are not that they're given platform on BBC or CNN, right? They're already reported in a negative way, and people who listen to the rhetoric of them are already the ones who subscribe to this idea, so you don't expand the debate.
Exactly, and the problem is that we have in the US a bias against media. We don't have a bias against government. If the government that's Republican controlled tells you it's bad, then those people will listen because they still believe that that's the government that represents them. That's critically different from media that they think is liberal and biased. The second point then on acceptability and everyday discrimination is social acceptability and how it leads to political accessibility. We see in the Netherlands with Geert Wilders, we see all over Europe, we see in the US that as soon as you move far to the right, political parties will follow. So we think if we don't stop it now, we get more political clash and discrimination against those groups. But most importantly is the last point, that discrimination in everyday life means there's discrimination that you can't prevent. There will always be a legal loophole against discrimination on the workplace. If you can fire people by just saying it's about their bad work ethic, not that they are black. It's about higher sentences for black people when it comes to drug penalties. It's about being stopped more often by the police and having done police violence. Those are things that can't always be legally regulated, and they are committed because society thinks it's okay and that's something they should do. If we stop that, and we can't do it through the political process, we stop everyday discrimination. That's good. We are very proud of this.
I thank the member of government for the first member of opposition.
So, I think as long as there is a thought of a man or woman, there's something evil to it. There's always some evilness. And the current debate is about how to cut this evilness, how to short it, and how to manage it. There's always some evilness, and we want to get rid of it. And then now, by saying that we need to change our norms, we need to see how those norms are changing actually. How are we going to condemn racism if there isn't nothing to condemn? There's no actual public discussion in the current situation when we ban something that we want to condemn. We don't have any kind of opponent in this kind of situation now. And now we see that we want to actually make those norms out of this discussion, out of showing someone that there's actual issue in the society, not hiding it behind curtains. Now, we're being told that at the moment, those groups in the United States, they don't gain a lot of success or support from the companies because they're stigmatized. No, thank you. And yes, of course, they're stigmatized at the present moment. Now, what we see is that only a certain small amount of individuals are prepared to support them because they're actually thinking that it's immoral to have this kind of organization. Now, if we ban this kind of organization, what I'm going to speak later on more and more is that we have another canalization of those people going to somewhere else, or perhaps joining Republican Party, perhaps joining something that actually sees a better way to challenge ideas of, I don't know, normal society and being racist, rather than sticking to the stigmatized society already. Now we want to actually stick with the stigma. We want to say that in the normal dining table, if you have a father of a family, doesn't come to the dining table, start saying that, you know, this government is crazy, it's banning free speech. We want this father of the dinner table still say that I don't think that KKK is okay or neo-Nazis are wrong because they're too radical for me. And this too radical sign has to stick together so people wouldn't normalize the situation to say that it's an interesting thing. It's something other, as happened with alt-right. What happened with alt-right? First of all, actually, they were neo-Nazis, but now they're suddenly popular in the United States. What happened? Because first of all, they changed the name. Second of all, they changed the stances. They became softer. They became acceptable by the large majority. And what happened over there was that now they lost the stigma. And we don't want this to happen. If we ban those extremist groups, we're not saying that at the moment that something is extreme. What we're saying actually is that we don't want to deal with it. We don't want to deal with this kind of racism, but all the other racism. For example, in the Republican Party, well, we won't tackle it because we cannot ban the Republican Party. And what's the kind of situation? It's just such that some kind of racism is okay. Racism and hate speech inside of Republican Party is okay. But if the question is about KKK, well, then we will ban it because it's too marginal, as they say it. Too marginal, so we don't want to deal with it, and it's easy to ban. But larger racism, such as institutional racism in the United States, such as police racism, such as Republican Party, that's okay. Opening.
We've given you analysis that exclusively these groups have no meaningful discourse with the rest of society. Republicans do have that, institutions do have that, these groups don't.
Well, great that we have this kind of discussion with Republicans and we don't have discussion with them because we've already stigmatized them. Now that we start having those discussions with Republicans, we know that behind Trump is standing the racist banning, and then he's also there. He's also there and we'll have to deal with him. So the issue stands still there, that the racism is still inside the government and we don't have any kind of other method than just saying that those people over there are racist. We're kind of not. We think that we should say that all of them are racist and then to pick a larger sign and actually deal with these kinds of problems, not just to deal with anything smaller. Now what we want to do is that we want to see that, no, thank you, they are being condemned. And they say that if you're banned, then you're condemned. We see that this signal is a bit different. Now from a first argument, I'll call it an Erdogan effect, the Turkish president. What happened with Tayyip Erdogan was that 20 years ago he was imprisoned. He was imprisoned for a poem being too extreme. Also, his party was banned. The issue was that Turkey didn't want any kind of religion inside of the politics. Now, nowadays, what we're seeing is that Erdogan is popular again. Erdogan is a president of Turkey. Rather than being banned or imprisoned, he's a president of Turkey. And how did this happen? This happened really simply. As they said before about the average Joe. Now, the average Joe over here, he doesn't join KKK. He doesn't join anything that's a bit too radical to him. But inside of the United States and also in the world, the average Joe sees that if there are some basic rights to be defended, for example, the freedom of free speech, then they're going to actually pick the spot and start to defend. Even if they don't agree with their ideas, they don't want government banning something. And now what we see is that, thank you, what's happening in Europe and all over the world at the moment is that Le Pen and all of those kinds of groups are already saying that they're being unfairly treated. They're being unfairly treated, their freedom of speech is being cut off, and then so on and so on. As we see the hate speech discussion, no thank you, we see that they're saying that we're attacking them, rather than the vice versa, that they are attacking us. And they're using this undemocratic move that we're making against us, saying that this is not democratic. And then we'll have to defend democracy rather than anything else. No thank you. So what happened was Turks went on to barricades to defend the Erdogan's right to free speech. And now Erdogan is a prime minister. And what we see is that this will turn against democratic society. This will happen that people in the United States will start to defend their right for free speech. Now the second thing over there is that we see this KKK person as a wolf in a sheepskin. What happens is that now he doesn't have the KKK, but he still needs a political platform. He still has his own ideas. Now, this need is canalized into, for example, let's say Republican Party, maybe something else, but something larger that his ideas are together with others. Now, this is a mix-up that we can see that he's actually legitimate. And what happens is that the hate speech inside of the Republican Party carries on. Now, we see that this is, well, losing the stigma that they see that it's not okay. What we see is that now for KKK, it looks like a softer KKK, like alt-right is at the moment. And I start to being more and more inside of the Republican Party. And what we need at the present moment from the Republican Party is that there would be a Marco Rubio and saying in Twitter that something about racism is bad, instead of not doing that, and then because there's no kind of situation, we know that if there's something like KKK, we want to ban it, but not start a public discussion. So Republicans won't say anything, and the society will be more racist after that. Thank you.
I think member of opposition on the government vote.
Should abominable hate speech be protected by freedom of speech? We say no. Would the lives of minorities be better with the existence of extreme groups like the KKK or neo-Nazis? We say no. Is it acceptable for social norms to be radicalized with the rhetoric of the far right? We say no. Before moving on to the summary of the debate, I would like to do a couple of rebuttals to the feeble response we got to the material that Nico presented to you. So first and foremost, the member of opposition came here and tried to tell you that neo-Nazis are now accepted by a large number of Americans. This is a clear mischaracterization. As I will later continue with the description of our substantives, the characterization that we brought to you is that far-right groups in the US, such as neo-Nazis or the KKK, are in the very, very small minority, not largely accepted by majority, as the member of opposition tried to characterize. Secondly, President Erdogan, the substantive that they brought, this is also invalid because he was put into power because of the rise of the alt-right, the rise of far-right rhetoric in Europe, which stemmed from the acceptance of far-right rhetoric in society, which is what we are preventing with the mechanism that the government is bringing you today. So before moving on, a couple points of clash in this debate. So this debate really boils down to like three things. So first and foremost, should hate speech be also protected by freedom of speech as the opposition claims? Justice Ruth Ginsburg of the United States Supreme Court said that a man's right to swing his fist ends when the other man's nose starts. So, of course, freedom of speech is one of the core tenets of the United States. Nevertheless, this should not come at the expense of harming others through violence, as seen in the Charlottesville March, where 20 people were ran over by a car and one woman died because of an alt-right extremist. No, thank you. Moving on to the second point of clash. So, does this make the lives of minorities better? So this is where the comparative came in between. We either ban groups that actively say blacks do not deserve as equal rights as whites, or the opposition came and tried to tell you there will be a backlash if they go underground, it'll be hard to regulate. And of course, the opposition doesn't merit in saying, of course, it will be hard to regulate if it goes underground. All these groups will be, like, the rhetoric may become more toxic, but this is a comparative that we bring you today. Panel. So the comparative is either we have an active condemnation from the government where the government says this is not acceptable, this is not democratic values to say all these extreme rhetorics, against having possible backlashes. So when we weigh the two harms that can be brought in the government silently acquiescing that these things may be acceptable by not doing anything, compared to the backlash that may come from few minority extremist groups, no thank you, that may be, say, the few backlash that may come from the small number of extremists, we say that the government's harms that are the harms that are mitigated by the government's policies are much greater, and that is why we win the comparative. Now moving on to substantives that my partner Nico brought to you. So what did Nico tell you today? First and foremost, he came and gave you a more accurate characterization in the debate about the realities of extremist groups, and second, talked about how this affects social acceptance. So talk about the first point of substantive, about how the accurate characterization of extremist groups such as the KKK or neo-Nazis for the first time in this debate. So as Nico described to you, these parties are aloof and there's a social stigma. So you're not going to have big corporations like Walmart or like banks basically funding the KKK or funding neo-Nazis because that there's a line of moral decency. So how do these groups get their funding? From small donors that buy into the rhetoric of the alt-right, from small donors that believe in the white superiority. So that's why these groups, no thank you. These groups struggle and these groups try to strive for more visibility by holding extremely big alt-right marches such as the one in Charlottesville. They strive for visibility because without visibility, without these small donors, they cannot exist because of the lack of funds. So what do we do with the government's policy by banning these groups from existing or at least making them illegal? It makes it harder for the average Joe, it makes it harder for the average American citizen as a small donor to fund these extremist groups. Therefore, this gives you a more accurate characterization of the groups that we are talking about in this debate and a more accurate characterization of the impact that our policy will have on these extremist groups. So before moving on to the second point of substantive, I'll take a point from the opening.
A person who believes or prone to believe that black people and immigrants are destroying America will just say, fine, I won't do it if government who he doesn't trust tell them that it's wrong. Do I read you correctly?
That is exactly the comparative that I brought to you today. Of course there will be backlash, of course there could be individual actors that can act upon their beliefs, but what is more pernicious? Having a government, having President Donald Trump not saying anything to condemn the far-right, alt-right groups that are white supremacists and racist, versus having a couple individual lone wolves. We say that the harms that the government mitigates is much greater, that's why we win the clash. But moving on to the second point about social acceptability. So right now, so people listen to the rhetoric of the alt-right, and like the line of what is socially acceptable is slowly moving to the right and slowly becoming more extreme. This is what happened in Europe with the rise of the alt-right. But then we tell you that it is not acceptable for having to allow these extremist groups to have these pernicious rhetorics of racism and hatred and have it not be condemned by society. Why is that? Because it allows for it to be more socially acceptable when there is more exposure to things like this and there is no lashback from the government, there is no control from the government. So there is more of a line, more of a social acceptability now than compared to Barack Obama's presidency to say more racist rhetoric because President Donald Trump goes unresponded to these racist issues, to issues about race and hatred. So why is this problematic? This is because political radicalization, the rise of the alt-right in politics is directly stemmed from the social radicalization of rise of the alt-right. This is given by two analogous international examples. For example, the Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, they face extreme hatred from radical groups in Myanmar that discriminated against Muslims. So that became the social norm. It is a social norm in that country for Muslims to be discriminated, and this is reflected in the political arena where these groups do not receive the protection of the government. And the same can happen from the United States, where if we do not have preventative measures, if we allow for these extremist groups to go on with their pernicious and the destructive dialogue about hatred in America, it becomes more socially acceptable, and that may in the future lead to political acceptability of racist rhetoric, political acceptability of discrimination, the way the Rohingya Muslims right now in Myanmar are discriminated even to this day. This is why we say the cost and the risk of letting these extremist groups continue with the hatred rhetoric is too high, as it can lead to direct political discrimination. What have we brought to you today? Firstly, we showed you that hate speech is not protected by freedom of speech. Secondly, we showed you that in the comparative of the debate, the minorities' lives are a lot better under our side versus letting extremist groups exist. And thirdly, we brought you, the extension brought you a more accurate characterization of extremist groups and why we cannot allow social norms to become more radicalized. For these reasons, we are so incredibly proud to propose.
I think the government will and there's a problem and politician will.
Okay, dear panel, this debate is not whether we should condemn far-right or extremist groups. This debate is whether we should ban them. And that is a key difference that this debate seems to be gone a bit wrong. So 2 things. We do not have to defend violence. We do not have to defend hate speech. We have to defend the existence of these groups. And secondly, we do not have to give up our own values in order to, fight someone else's. That is what they want to do. So I'm going to summarize this debate in 2 points. First, I'm going to talk about the reverse effect, how, when they actually ban those parties, they give them more legitimacy, they give them more power to, in future, actually gain their values and, gain their views. And secondly, about, hiding the problem and about social norms, what they said, and a few points of rebuttal will be integrated. We see that, currently we see that, those far-right groups in America, they are gaining popularity in some ways. They say that, KKK only has 3,000 members and, they're all like, minute and not important. First of all, members does not equal supporters. All those people on the streets of Charlottesville were not members of specific parties or groups. They were just people who followed those ideas, supported those ideas, or just, saw a call out and went to them. So they cannot say that those groups, are meaningless or don't exist. Secondly, we see that some of those groups have already, gained mainstream political value. Like my partner told you about alt-right group that was basically started out as an hate speech group on the internet, trolling out. Now they basically are inside the government. Leader of Breitbart News is basically the chief of staff of the White House. So we see that, that is the way they gain, legitimacy. So we see that what people actually want, when what people are standing out, why those people are on the streets is because they feel left behind. Those are, that is what, the left behind generation who apparently voted Donald Trump into power. They feel that the government does not respect them, does not respond to them, does not take them seriously, and will not listen to their problems. Now, by banning them, you are conferring their fears. You're telling to them, yes, this is true. We do not care about you. We do not care about your issues. What you have been afraid all of this time is true. Now, for some reason, they think that when the people get that signal, they will now calm down. They will say that, oh, okay, fine. Now that I'm banned, I don't care about those issues anymore. We don't think that's true. We think those people will still be angry. They are more likely to step out to the streets, and they are more likely to get the coverage they want. Because what we heard from the government side is, those groups rely on coverage. They rely that, people hear about them. And how do they get coverage? Currently, they got most coverage by, driving a car into people and killing them, doing illegal things. They have shown us before they do not care about laws. So by banning them, they don't care about it. They will still act out, they will still gather, they will still do all those things, but now they will have more justification, they will have a clear enemy, and they will have a clear goal to fight against by being legal, they have an actual, another thing. And in those cases, all those talks about, oh, they won't get money if they're not, legal, are totally unimportant, because if we see that, they can show people that, that people are willing to come out to the streets, people want to come out to the streets, and people are already acting for them, the money doesn't matter in those cases. They have the manpower, they have the ways to do it. We see, and we see that it is very easy to also fund illegal activities. It's being done all over the world. We don't see how that will change in America with banning those groups. But okay, now, first opening.
Look, if these groups are taken to court, if we engage individuals that act out, then all these actions still lead to condemnation. Just because murder is banned doesn't mean that it's not condemned.
Yeah, sure. You can take those organizations to court. You can call out hate speech. When somebody disrespects you, you can sue them. You can still do all those things without actually banning those groups. If a member of a KKK murders someone, you put them to jail. Why do you have to close down the entire organization he belonged to? You have never shown us that. You have never shown that the organization itself has some kind of fundamental idea that, destroys the society by itself. If it has violent members, we already have laws to deal with them. Why do we need to ban the entire organization, especially when we have brought you multiple negative effects of what to do it? But okay, let's talk about hiding the problem and social norms and so on. They said that in the current system where, those people are not being condemned, they will become a social norm. Few problems with that. First of all, they are being condemned. The only person who took his time with condemning them is Donald Trump, and I think yesterday he already did it. So, even that thing is gone. But the entire establishment Republican Party condemned them, and we see that, the condemnation is coming without actually a need to ban those things. So we don't see that, how they can become a social norm that way. But we see that, by actually allowing, by actually banning them, by forcing them away from their methods. Even, let's assume you are correct, let's assume they don't, act out on violent ways, they don't go to the streets, they will use alternative methods. They will use the methods of, legitimate politics. They will try to get into politics, like we saw with Erdogan, like we saw with Le Pen's in France. His father was an extremist who people did not very much like because they couldn't get along with his extreme ideas. But when her daughter came out and, sounded a bit reasonable and seemed like a civil person with just not very acceptable views, more people were willing to vote for them. So we see that will now happen. Those people will more likely join, those parties, and it is already happening with alt-right movement that has already basically invaded the Republican Party and created a civil war in there. So we don't see to give them extra motivation to do it, to give them their only outlet for political activism. Those parties, and they themselves say that when Republican Party does it, we cannot ban them for two reasons. First of all, they say that we can have a discourse with Republican Party, but not with extremists, which is, first of all, you can have discourse with anybody if you try hard enough. Second of all, discourse with Republican Party, the most gridlocked country in the world, where two parties don't get along and are not willing to accept on anything in the parliament for the last 8 years. I don't see any discourse happening there. Second of all, they say that the Republican Party is an exception because they don't, shout out explicit hate speech, which is also not true. Donald Trump in his rallies explicitly has, told people that, if that guy comes to this rally again, beat him up and stuff like that. That is explicit hate speech. That is explicitly calling out to violence. So we see that, you are giving them a safe haven that is a larger platform, and you are motivating them to move to those larger platforms. And we see that that is a negative thing. That is when people actually, gain political power, come into power, actually, they have a president now and can get those laws enforced. And we don't want that option to be their only option. We see them, let them be weak, let them be small, let us have more power over them, let us condemn them publicly. And we see that that is a reason why we should not allow them. So in conclusion, we see that this debate is not whether about, hate speech is okay or violence is okay. Those things are condemned, and those things can be condemned without actually banning those things. This is whether those organizations should exist and whether those people are better off existing in these organizations under the current legal frame, or should they find their new ways, alternative ways, which we have shown you are negative. So proud to oppose. Thank you.
I thank you for this great demonstration. Please go outside, shake hands in that order, deliberate, and call you back when you have to.
Guys, does anyone know how to stop the streaming? I don't want our discussion stream. I'm just going to disconnect this.